So in preparation for this, I wrote some tweets so that I could refer to these, and also if I run out of time, I can refer you to my tweets. So I'm going to try and focus. I've got 11 points, which my partner assured me was too many for a 10-minute talk, so let's see how I get on. I'm going to maybe say a bit more on the points that were less covered by Tim and Megan. But to start off with, just really to highlight that women are not a homogenous group. Obviously, in a 10-minute talk, I have to simplify a lot, but women's experiences vary substantially by other factors, and even throughout the course of one woman's life. My experience of cycling in London is different to what it was 15 years ago. I'm less keen to go around Old Street roundabout at 20 miles an hour. So, you know, there are differences, but as was also highlighted, there are a lot of similarities too. It's worth pointing out that mode share for women may be 1% in this country. It's only 3% for men. It's not like we're doing things really well for men and really badly for women. It's not really very good for men either. So I wanted first of all to say something about route quality, and maybe to highlight a couple of points that are perhaps less well understood. So firstly, there is the issue about protected infrastructure, probably the most talked about and certainly a very important issue. So I led a systematic review of studies that looked at preferences for protected infrastructure away from cars, which classically cycle tracks, but could also be routes away from motor traffic or very quiet streets. And these studies all found that people generally wanted to cycle away from motor traffic. This is a general preference, but most of the studies also found that women express stronger preferences than men. So it is a discrimination issue, if you like. If we have a system for cycling that is not protected, it affects women even more than it affects men. But a second issue that perhaps is less well understood is around route directness. So as distances increase, people's likelihood of cycling falls. We call it distance decay curves, kind of goes like that. So if we increase distances, for instance, by making people go round the houses, it's likely to put people off cycling. But this curve is steeper for women and older people. So actually it's kind of another discriminatory issue. It's if people have to go twice as far cycling to reach their destination, that is likely to discourage cycling among women more than men, among older people more than younger people. It's kind of a double whammy. The direct route is unpleasant and puts you off, but then the long route is too long and also puts you off. Thirdly, I wanted to mention physical obstacles. So, you know, we all know physical obstacles if we cycle, right? Cyclists dismount signs, lack of dropped curbs, gates, barriers, all this kind of thing. So why is this an issue for women? Well, it's one of these it's often one of these interactions. So women are more likely than men to be travelling with children. If you're travelling with children on a bike, you may have a cargo bike, or maybe you've got a kid on the back. Now, if you have to navigate through a barrier, this may be impossible. More women than men have mobility impairments. You may not be able to lift your bike. So obstacles are annoying for everyone, but they can absolutely stop some people from travelling, and more so women than men. So again, it's an inclusive design issue. If we sort these things out, then it'll improve things for everyone really, but particularly for groups that are currently most discouraged from cycling. I wanted to mention also harassment and discrimination. This is something that affects a lot of people, women and men, in public space more broadly, and it's under-researched. We talk about, there's a lot of research on public transport, discrimination, harassment on public transport, important research. There is not as much work on cycling, the experiences that people have while cycling. And yet this again is a kind of double whammy, because sometimes the quiet routes go, through a tunnel, through a housing estate, through a park that doesn't feel safe at night, along a river that doesn't feel safe at night, and so on. So we need to always think, do people feel safe socially? Do people feel safe in the evening when cycling on this route? And more broadly, you know, we shouldn't just be building routes that avoid those kind of areas. We also need to be working towards public space that's welcoming for all, where everybody feels safe. You know, again, this is something that will improve things more broadly. A point I wanted to highlight was around where routes go, and this is something that's maybe been discussed less as well. Hopefully there's a growing consensus on what a good route looks like, and that I think is actually a big step forward. You know, a few years ago there was a sense that, well, you know, what is a good route? Actually, some people are saying a good route is a bus lane, some people are saying a good route is a protected track, and I think now we've got more consensus on what a good cycle route is. But where do those good cycle routes go? If we build those good cycle routes, say, to big financial centres, that are key workplaces for middle-class men, we shouldn't be that surprised if people using those routes are disproportionately male. If we're building them to destinations that are more used by men than women, that will feed through into who uses the routes. So we need to think about the different destinations. And again, this isn't just a gender point, this is thinking about different communities, people of different ages. If we build for commute trips, retired people are not commuting. Are we building for the trips that different groups of people want to make? And the school run is still disproportionately female. If we're not thinking about trips to school, it's to do with image. If there's this image of a cyclist as a particular, it's a man in his 30s. Look at the cover of Cycle Infrastructure Design, right? There's a man in his 30s, he's like this, he's next to an HGV, it's all fine. That person doesn't really exist. There's very few of these people. But that is the image. It's not just an image. It's also what guides policy, planning and practice. It's been happening for many years. So again, this is also around the types of trips that people make. We often plan for the commute and a particular idea of the commute from A to B. But most people, it's not like that. It's not that simple. They maybe go to school, they go to work, they go back from work, they go to the shops, they go home. So if we just build for this A to B commute, it's only a minority of trips, it's only a minority of the population. It's not thinking more broadly, and this feeds through into what data we collect, what we count. I could go on for this, for ages about this, but it's about data and research and planning as well. And just to say something, I'm involved in a tool called the Propensity to Cycle tool, which sadly doesn't cover Scotland, I'm afraid. It does cover England and Wales. And we just did commute trips, looking at cycling potential. And we're just about to release this week a layer for schools, and it really highlights to me the fact that potential for school travel is complementary to potential for travel to work, but where the spatial distribution is different. So if we just build for commuting, then we are, we're not building for trips to school, and we're also disproportionately discouraging women's commuting because those trips to work are more likely to involve trips to school. So this is really important. I was also wanting to say something on affordability. So again, not a problem that necessarily affects all women. I cycle to work on a standard hybrid, about 300 quid. I can afford that. That's not a problem. But for many women, single parents, for instance, may be wanting a cargo bike. They need to move their kids in a cargo bike. Cargo bikes are very expensive. An older woman who needs a bike is a mobility aid. She needs an e-bike. E-bikes, again, are quite expensive. So for some women, affordability is a big issue, as is storage, having appropriate places to store more expensive bikes. I wanted also to return to the question of policy, language and imagery. So these barriers, and say something a bit more generally about barriers. So I sometimes worry, with some of the research, you get a kind of list of barriers. There's this barrier, this barrier, this barrier and this barrier. And it's not like that. It's all part of a system that works together to discourage people from travelling actively, and particularly some groups. So for instance, the thing around appearance. If we had a cycling system that was safe, comfortable, you didn't have to rush, people wouldn't worry about arriving at work looking flustered and looking, because go to the Netherlands and you'll see that they cycle with umbrellas. So that if you go to a business meeting, your mascara isn't going to run, you're not going to end up with your suit looking messy. But you can't cycle around with an umbrella in London at the moment. It's not that kind of environment yet. Although I did once, I had some Dutch colleagues visiting and they were cycling in front of me over Waterloo Bridge with an umbrella, and I was absolutely terrified. It was fine. Images are not only pictures, as I said before. It's really important that we understand that these images, these ways of talking about cycling, and particularly cyclists, are part of planning processes, and it's really hard to shift them. People will still default to thinking about that guy on the cover of Cycle Infrastructure Design as the cyclist. And it puts a lot of people off cycling, but it maybe particularly puts you off if you're, say, an older woman that looks nothing like you, and it also looks like, it looks scary. It doesn't look like the kind of person you might be. It looks like the kind of person that you might be nervous of. So it's really important to have those inclusive images, and that also reinforces the need for wider, more diverse involvement in planning, in not just in terms of employment in the planning sector from a senior level down, but also involving diverse communities in planning for cycling. But I just wanted to finally to finish with a point that it's not just about the people, it's also about the systems. We kind of need systems that work to plan inclusively, you know, whoever's doing the planning in a sense. And too often we sort of put the equality work on the people who are already most affected, already having to fight against this stuff, and they have to educate other people. And we also need systems that work so that we don't need people, women or whoever it is, doing additional work all the time. It needs to just work. It needs to create equality. Thank you.